The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Hack Surfer podcast. Today's date is December 5th, 2014. I want to take this opportunity to introduce our panelists. First, we have Mike Fell. He's a Surfwatch Labs data analyst. Our Hack Surfer editor, Jeff Peters, is with us, and I'm Matt Lightfuss. I'm a writer for Hack Surfer. We can kick it over to Jeff and Mike. Anything interesting this week that you guys want to talk about, starting off?
Yeah, I guess this seemed like a pretty crazy week, really. It's just a lot of big stories in the news. Monday night I was watching Netflix at home and got kicked off. Xbox Live got taken down by Lizard Squad. There's all the craziness going on at Sony. There's been a few breaches in retail and other places. Just kind of a whole lot, really, that we could talk about. But I guess the most interesting story to me that really isn't getting much coverage is this Fin4 hacking group. They're targeting executives actually targeted more than 100 different companies, two-thirds of which were pharma. They're basically trying to steal inside information on mergers and acquisitions, kind of try to get basically insider information, so they can make money off the stock market. I thought it was a pretty interesting story, but it really hasn't been getting a lot of coverage just with all the other stuff that's going on. I actually jumped into Surfwatch Labs data this morning, and the group was the 29th most discussed cybercrime actor. So pretty far down the list, kind of surprised me. But we don't need to talk about that too much. The interview we have with Matt Porzio I did yesterday, that's going to be at the end of the podcast, so we'll kind of get into that. I guess I'll kick it over to Mike. Is there anything kind of interesting that stood out to you this week?
Yes, one story that I found that was interesting this week that is on hacksurfer.com was the Operation Cleaver, which is an espionage campaign, it seems, or state-sponsored cyber espionage campaign aimed at airlines, automakers, natural gas producers, defense contractors, and militaries around the world. In total, it looks like there is 50 targets in 16 countries known to be compromised by this campaign, state-sponsored campaign. There's around 10 victims in the U.S., 4 in Israel, and 5 in Pakistan, with groups in the U.K., France, Germany, and numerous Middle Eastern countries also compromised by the attack. There's been a lot of speculation. The report that mentioned this specific operation fingered Iran as the primary backer of this espionage campaign, or this campaign. However, we haven't really been able to see any sort of evidence suggesting that it is Iran. So again, attribution, which we'll probably talk about a little later, other issues is a big issue with this.
Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting story as well, just because with the media, there's just so much focus on consumer goods, and rightfully so, especially with the holiday season approaching. But it's kind of interesting to see, all this cybercrime going on in other sectors, with that Fin4 group, and then with all the industrial kind of critical infrastructure areas getting targeted. So I just thought that was kind of interesting that those stories are kind of seeming to go under the radar, even though they're quite important. So Matt, you got a chance to look at some of the data and see what everyone's talking about this week. Anything that sticks out to you?
Well, number one, and it's kind of funny because I think everyone here at Hack Surfer and Surfwatch Labs has kind of been joking about this all week. Can we not see another story about Sony? But Sony Pictures Entertainment is by far the number one top trending target of the week. Everyone's talking about it. We talked about it a little bit last week in the podcast, so just to give a little background information, Sony Pictures was hacked by a cybercriminal group called Guardians of Peace. They were demanding all kinds of stuff, but what ended up happening was the group ended up leaking some films. They took down Sony's email, and they released sensitive information about a lot of employees and even some of the top executives, like, for instance, their salary and things like that. Probably one of the bigger stories with this, and I'm going to kick it to you guys after this because I think we've had conflicting stories and heard other things, but it's rumored that Sony believes that hackers in North Korea are behind this attack. Have you guys seen or heard anything else?
Yeah, I was actually looking around this morning just before we started recording this. I saw one article that said, Sony's rumored, they're going to come out and name North Korea as the perpetrator. I also saw that a couple days ago. Then I clicked on a second story that said all these cybersecurity professionals are saying it's not North Korea, it's actually an inside job. So it seems like there's still a lot of conflicting, I guess, sort of evidence. I think a researcher from Norse, or the CTO of Norse, actually said that he believes it's really not North Korea, but the FBI, I guess, has found some evidence that the software had been compiled in Korea. So in terms of attribution, I guess I don't really know when that's going to be resolved.
And ultimately, even though attribution is an important issue and it helps us understand motives of the threat actor who's conducting the attacks, from the point of view of Sony Entertainment, I mean, who really cares? They need to really look to the future or improve their systems, cybersecurity, and they have to mitigate the lost data. So even though attribution is an important issue, they have a lot of other issues that they really need to focus on rather than whodunit.
Yeah, and all these stories seem to be focused on talking about whether it's North Korea or whether it's an inside job. But really the most important thing is this malware that they were targeted with, this wiper or destover malware. I've heard it called two different things. I guess it was earlier this week that the FBI issued a flash alert saying that they discovered this new malware that has the capability to overwrite a victim host master boot record and all data files, making it extremely difficult and costly, if not impossible, to recover the data. So it seems like this attack is more about destruction. And I saw another interesting quote from Richard Clark. He said he can't remember seeing an attack like this that's happened before in the U.S. He said you normally see hacks that steal information, but this one seems to be purely about destruction, and that's very rare. This morning I saw another post from F-Secure. They're talking about how the Sony attack is fast becoming the worst hack any company has ever publicly suffered. So, I mean, everyone's talking about Sony, and I think probably rightfully so, because this is a pretty devastating attack.
The next topic I want to talk about is consumer goods in general. Taking a look at the top 10 trending targets this week that are being discussed, 7 of them are in the consumer goods sector, with stores like BB potentially, from what we're seeing according to Brian Krebs, that they were compromised. He's noticed that some recent credit cards that were used at this store are being sold by cyber criminals on some of the underground markets. Another reason, could be it's the holiday shopping season. Maybe that's why people are talking about a lot of consumer goods targets. It could be there's certainly a lot of speculation that we're just waiting for the next big breach. I actually wrote an article yesterday playing off of Jeff. You wrote an article back in October where you said that in October we were at 60 companies that were tied to POS malware. Well, according to the data from what I saw, from that time we've added 6 more. So we're actually up to 66, and we still have the entire month of December left to go. So consumer goods, and pretty well discussed this week.
That's the number of companies that has sort of been publicly counted. But, if you look at like the Signature Systems breach, which was kind of what caused, the Jimmy John's breach that everyone was talking about, just with that breach alone, there was 108 other small restaurants and eateries that were compromised. So the number is probably much, much higher than the 66 that we're at now. But those are just the major companies that have been discussed in the news and talked about.
And to add, it's not only retailers and restaurants that are getting compromised. This week, we learned that one of the largest parking garage operators in the country was compromised in a data breach. 17 facilities around the country, mainly in Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, were compromised through a remote access tool that installed malware. It's unclear if criminals actually obtained the data, but they were able to gain access. So not only retailers and restaurants, but even parking garages are being compromised by these criminals.
I don't know if you guys saw the 60 Minutes interview on Sunday, which had Brian Krebs and people from FireEye and other stuff in there. Usually when I see cybersecurity stuff on the news, it's generally kind of terrible, I think. They don't usually do a good job covering it. But I thought the 60 Minutes interview did it pretty well. And a couple of the quotes that really stood out to me was, near the end, they were one person was talking about how you're trying to secure a house of straw. The payment cards themselves are fundamentally fraud prone. So I think that's really the big problem is, everyone is kind of waiting for the next breach and just kind of sitting there, knowing it's going to happen, but there's really not a lot that they can do just because the payment system we have here in the U.S. is so kind of broken, I guess I'd say.
And antiquated.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think those are really the big stories of the week. Obviously everyone's talking about Sony, a lot of consumer goods stuff, which is probably going to continue through the holiday season. Moving on, do we have any good cyber tips this week, Matt?
Yeah, our cyber tip this week comes from David Britton. Britton's the Vice President of Industry Solutions at 41st Parameter. And Britton says, what we typically find is really happening is most of the malware on market today, whether it's using man-in-the-browser tactics, whether it's using things like session hacking, whether it's using things like HTML injection, almost every case, they're still simply harvesting credentials.
I think that's an interesting tip just because, we always see these stories, there's 80,000 new pieces of malware being created every day or every hour or every minute or, some crazy headline like that. And we're talking about these point-of-sale breaches and we're talking about like this Fin4 hacking. Pretty much what everyone's trying to do is get access to your email or your point-of-sale systems or things like that. So I think it can be easy to get confused about cybersecurity and kind of where you should start. But I think if you just kind of recognize that most of the time what they're after is your credentials so that they can get in and steal information, that's really what you got to secure the most, whether it's two-factor authentication or secure passwords or, things like that. All right, well, thanks you guys for joining us. Coming up, we have an interview with Matt Porzio. He's the VP of Mergers and Acquisitions Strategy at Intralinks, and we discuss the Fin4 attacks and how that group is making money off stealing that insider information. Over the past year, I've read quite a bit just about people saying, manipulating the stock market is going to be, the next big cybercrime wave. Some experts are saying. So then this Fin4 group, turns out they're doing exactly that. A quote from the FireEye study I read, it said they're targeting individuals who have inside information about impending market catalysts, events that will cause the price of stocks to rise or fall substantially in a short period of time. So for people like me who are pretty ignorant about the financial markets, could you maybe explain what it is that this hacking group is after?
Yeah, so I think it's it's interesting that this report's come out recently. I mean, there's always been an element of insider trading in the market as a whole, and this quest for knowledge that others don't have to take advantage of in the marketplace. It's interesting. The term manipulation isn't what I'd exactly use here, although I do think that the internet and cybercrime does relate to stock market manipulation, but more where cyber criminals are posting kind of false statements or creating events that seem to be happening at a company to benefit their investments or their trades, right? So that's kind of more pure manipulation. What I'd categorize this Fin4 group doing is really more exploiting a flavor of insider trading. It's just a new way that they're procuring knowledge. They're essentially stealing it online and hacking into people's email versus, insider trading, which is normally, a person-to-person thing. Somebody gives their friend, some inside information about something that's happening at the company that could be a major event, either positive or negative. These guys are finding that out by essentially targeting or spear phishing, these senior executives who have the knowledge of what's happening with these public companies. The report highlights numerous ones in the pharmaceutical and biotech space in particular, where there are a lot of events that can really move stock prices either higher or lower. But that's really what's going on here. And those events, as you mentioned, can be mergers and acquisitions. Obviously, companies that are selling themselves look to get a premium from their current stock price, right, to create shareholder value. If you know about that in advance before the company sold, you're going to benefit, right, if you invest in before that deal is announced. So those are some of the ways that, these cyber criminals are really just phishing and trying to steal information about what might affect these stock prices. So they're sort of infiltrating and getting insider information in a new way.
I was kind of thinking back about a year ago. I interviewed someone, and they were talking. I asked them about stock prices being manipulated, and it's kind of a slightly unrelated thing, but they were talking about how like Bitcoin at the time was really volatile, and they were talking about how cyber criminal groups were maybe capitalizing on that, and investing. And I thought that was kind of similar in a way to in the FireEye report. They're just talking about how the healthcare and pharmaceutical sectors kind of has more movement. So if you look at those specific sectors. I guess I found that interesting. I don't know if you kind of agree.
Yeah, it really is telling when you look at the industries that this Fin4 cyber criminal group is focused on. As I mentioned earlier, biotech, pharmaceutical, and the healthcare industry. One, there's a lot of M&A and deal activity, right? There's a lot of companies being bought and sold. There's a lot of, licensing deals where somebody has developed a drug or molecule that they don't really have use for, but someone else could add it to a product they're developing, to make it more effective and sell more units of it. So there's a lot of that activity. But I think even more importantly, what potentially this Fin4 group is spearfishing for is in pharma biotech, FDA approval or denial can move stocks massively in a very short period of time. So, if they're able to, essentially hack into the email of an executive of that company, the CEO who knows that FDA approval and they're working on an announcement with their PR firm, say, if you know about that early, you can get in and, go long on that stock. And then once it's announced in the whole market and everyone jumps into that stock because they're going to be able to sell their new drug out in the market, you can make a lot of money, right? So it's interesting, and just to give an example, I remember a company about 5 years ago called Vanda Pharmaceuticals. And when they announced that they got FDA approval, and I think it was a schizophrenia drug that they got approval on, the stock went from just $1 to $8 in one day once that announcement came out. So if you're one of these cyber criminals and you're in the CEO's email and a week before that you've gotten FDA approval and you're putting together the press release and you put $1 million to work in that stock over a week, and then on one day that $1 million turns into $8 million, and you just walked away with a $7 million profit in a couple of weeks. That's where getting to that information and essentially being in that CEO's inbox is a huge deal, right? Now the truth is, not all stocks have that reaction when they get FDA approval. They don't necessarily increase, 8 times or generate an 8 times return. But, information can be powerful. You still have to have a sense of how will the broader market react to that information, whether the information is, their drug just got approved and they're going to sell $1 billion of it, or the company's being sold for a 30% premium on its stock price. The market doesn't always react in the way you anticipate. So you probably want to make multiple bets out there if you're this organization.
Yeah, and you mentioned how this type of activities, sort of always occurred, like in regards to mergers and acquisitions and things like that. People always trying to get the upper hand. So I'm just curious, your sense on, in terms of the cyber world, is this, like a new thing that we should be concerned about, or is it just kind of an extension of what's always happened and kind of the same old story? It's kind of along those lines.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in a sense, this idea of trying to get insider information has always been something that criminal enterprises or unscrupulous people have tried to do. And as soon as I read the FireEye report, my mind went to one of my favorite movies, the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen. And if you remember in that movie, the Bud Fox character, the young guy, trying to get an advantage or an edge in the market, he actually started up a cleaning service. And in one of the scenes, he's dressed up as a cleaning guy, going through files at an investment bank to figure out which companies they were actively engaged in selling and how much, money they were going to sell, and then he would buy the stock, right? This is an example of, instead of the cleaning company, they're just trying to get into your email to see, is the CEO talking with, another CEO, a competitor, to buy them, and at what value? So it's sort of the new generation of snooping, but, the concept of people trying to always know if a deal's happening, how much, that company's going to be bought for, and when it's going to actually happen, has persisted for a long time. Now it's just a new angle. And I think what it's really highlighting is people have to be a lot more careful in how they execute deals, right? And how they think about the process. People think their email is safe and secure, right? You could talk about, hey, these guys just put in a bid for our company worth $1 billion. It's a great premium, but if you're writing that in an email and you think it's just internal between the CFO and the CEO, and now the Fin4 group is monitoring that, that's a problem.
Yeah. So I guess the follow-up question to that is, what should businesses or CEOs and board members, what should they be doing, or what should they look out for, if they're concerned about this kind of attack?
Yeah, and it's actually funny because we had a question earlier today from someone in the tech analyst community about that. Is this about you guys? Is this a concern for Intralinks? I think it's a concern overall for the marketplace, but it's actually something that will drive business to us because we've always said that, email and some of these lightweight, file sharing systems out there are not the way to execute deals, right? The CEO should actually stop communicating about deals through their email, stop sharing information about those deals. People shouldn't be putting, sale purchase agreements as attachments in emails anymore. That should all go online. And, it benefits us because we've been sort of the gold standard and pioneered the concept of a virtual data room and virtual deal making. So what that is, and, as a former banker, 13 plus years ago, when you were looking to sell a company, you had to have people come in and review physical documents with a bunch of boxes and binders, usually in a conference room, either at a hotel or at the law firm. And you'd have one, potential buyer after another come in, you'd schedule them, they'd bring all their lawyers, their accountants and bankers to pour through all this information to decide what is that company worth and how much, could we bid for it. That process was actually not a very secure process. We replaced it with a virtual data room because it was costly and inefficient and took too long and introduced a lot of execution risk in deals. But there were also security issues. I remember, running deals in very small towns like Paducah, Kentucky, where when you had 6 different teams of suits show up over 3 weeks, people knew something was happening, right? Sometimes they'd run into each other because they'd say it's the only 4-star hotel in the town, right? People would look at the logbook and figure out who else was involved in the deal. The locals would start to talk. So actually bringing the process online and allowing everyone to do it from the security of their own offices, took away some of that risk, made it more efficient. And then, the thing I would say directly related to, this fear of people hacking in to know if a deal's happening or get information about what it's worth, our system and the trust we've built in the market is based on our security vigilance, right? So we have something called multi-factor authentication, which is persistent. So even if the CEO's, login would get compromised and all of a sudden someone's logging in from a different location, our system would require them to have another form of authentication that hacker wouldn't have, right? Email and typical, kind of internal systems that people are utilizing don't have that, right? But our whole game, and for the last 16 years, and the more than $23.5 trillion in financial services transactions our system has helped facilitate, the whole thing is about security, right? And while no system is foolproof, it's something that everyone at Intralinks wakes up and thinks about every day and builds our system and our services to.
Yeah, and then I'm just kind of curious. I guess there's a lot of people talking about this story and, kind of manipulating the stock market. So I'm curious your thoughts on how serious or, how concerned people should be. I mean, obviously this attack seems pretty sophisticated to me. I read one story where they said, up to 5 businesses were hacked, just to figure out kind of one deal. So
yeah.
I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers of how many total companies, I'm not sure if you do, Jeff, were compromised across, what FireEye was able to detect. But, we think about we look at the deal market and, we've got a significant portion of the M&A market that flows through our system. But you're talking about, there are tens of thousands of mergers and acquisitions transactions globally that occur each year. If you're just in a few companies, you're not a huge issue. You might be a huge issue, and these cyber criminals might absolutely be able to make some money off of even the organizations they've hacked. But it doesn't seem to be, pandemic or an issue really across the board. Now, will a report like this, bring copycats, more people out of the woodwork? Sure. Like I said before, I think this will actually give people some pause and have them think about the process more, have them look to leverage secure technology more as opposed to being a little loose and thinking email and the way that they've done things or the way they do things in their daily life or as consumers are good enough. And it's not when you're at, the high stakes of the M&A market.
We're coming up on the end of the year, and a lot of people, sort of do predictions and stuff for 2015. Just wondering, your thoughts kind of looking forward. Obviously, cybersecurity is always, changing and shifting around. Is there anything in particular you think people should be looking out for?
In terms of, cybersecurity in particular, I don't really have a viewpoint. What I would say, something that, we're particularly interested in and relates to the M&A world is that the ability to share information, right? If you think about M&A, it's all about, I want to give the buy side as much information as they require and need to pay as much money for the asset or the company I'm selling, right? But at the same time, I need to control that information. I don't want, if a buyer walks away from a process and doesn't pay $1 billion for my company, that they now know who all my clients are, when their contracts renew, what I pay all my employees, all that information. I want to share it with them. I even want to share maybe my financial projections over the next 5 years, but I don't want them to be able to save that information, keep that content. So one of the things we've been focused on and has gotten a lot of traction and will continue to be an important part of people leveraging technology and deal making is information rights management. So the proprietary IRM that we've developed through actually an acquisition this year of a company called DocTracker, that is extremely important to give people the comfort of, I can share the information in its native format. I can give them the Excel financial model to make decisions about buying my company. But at any point in time, I can take back that content. I can prevent them from printing or saving it or forwarding it on. So I can share it in the process, but it doesn't have to be something that's out there that could hurt me long term. So, that's one of the key things. And just like you hear about, digital rights management in the music industry and that evolving, it's even more important when you're talking about, the lifeblood, the documents of a company that tell you, where they're headed and what they're doing.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, Matt. Appreciate it. All
right, Jeff. Take care.
That's it for this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen.